Hello, I'm Dick Durbin. Welcome to my Capitol Report, A Different View. The year 2011 marks the 150th anniversary of the beginning of the Civil War. It's a chapter in American history which is bloody and violent and threatened the very existence of the United States of America. One man who was central to that entire conflict came from right here in central Illinois, left this town of Springfield and moved on to Washington to become its president at one of the most fractious and divided times in our nation's history. Today we're at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum here in Springfield, Illinois, my hometown. We're going to talk a little bit about this museum, about the life of Abraham Lincoln, and about some of the opportunities for people who find themselves in central Illinois to learn a lot more about the man and the conflict that he faced. We couldn't have a better guest than our first, and that's Tom Schwartz, who's the Illinois State Historian. Glad you're with us today.
Thank you, Senator.
Well, tell me, how do you become the state historian?
It is an appointment by the governor, and my own trajectory was when I began to work for the library back in 1985 as curator of the Lincoln Collection. I did a series of major exhibits culminating in a 1993 show out at the Huntington Library in San Marino, California. At that time, the state historian, a fellow from Eastern Illinois University, Dr. Dwayne Albert, decided to retire from the position, left an opening, and Governor Jim Edgar then appointed me on November 19th, 1993, but a very important date for Lincoln buffs. So
let me take you into the present. As of 2004, if I'm not mistaken, this institution opened. Am I right?
Library opened in October of 2004. The museum opened April 19th, 2005.
Things have changed a lot in terms of telling the Lincoln story in this town because of this Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. How has it changed?
Visitor experience to Springfield used to be going to the various sites, but typically people would start with the end of the story if you were coming from Chicago, because the first site you go to would be the tomb. They'd get pieces of Lincoln's story and life, but there was no sense of how it all fit together. And they would always ask, where's the Lincoln Museum? And of course there wasn't any. The library was created in 1889, and there was a very large collection of Lincoln material within the library's holdings. Through the efforts of a number of people, including a very young and energetic congressman, who is now our senior state senator, helped us move along in the process to get to this spot. So what the museum does is it becomes this portal or entry point onto the larger Lincoln story, and provides that overview that help people understand then when they go to the old state capitol or the Lincoln Herndon Law Office or the home, New Salem, or the tomb, how that all fits. And they can get a more in-depth experience, and they also get the experience of being that sense of place.
Well, let me ask you this, Tom. When we worked together in the early days, we had some critics. In fact, some of them were historians, whom I respect very much. Some have passed away, but some are still living. And they said, you're turning this into a Disneyland operation here. This is supposed to be a very serious presidential museum. Well, there are, I guess, some Disney qualities to this in terms of the movies that are available for visitors and such. But tell me, as you look back now over 5 or 6 years of experience here and watch the people come and go by the hundreds of thousands into this museum and out again, and some returning, what is your impression of how this is presented and how it's received?
Our critics never understood the difference between the techniques and presentation versus the authenticity of the story. We invent nothing about the story. What we do is, instead of trying to tell the story just on original materials, original documents and artifacts, we find that it helps the public to provide these immersive scenes like the White House and
amazing.
These representational figures The story of the war is told right here in front of the White House. The military war for Union with Grant and McClellan, the war for emancipation and freedom with Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass. People go to Disneyland, they go to Universal Studios, they are accustomed to having their experiences in both a kind of a multimedia and in an enjoyable and engaging
So this brings that
setting.
It brings us technology to tell the story of history. And the first step, if I'm not mistaken, it's been a while,
Yeah.
is the movie. It's not that long, but it's powerful because it opens up Lincoln's eyes, tells kind of a story, a shorthand story of Lincoln before people begin this journey.
Right. The Union Theater that's directly behind us is an effects theater. And it's about a 18, 20-minute presentation, overview of Lincoln's life. But it does it in a very powerful way. When the war begins, for example, cannons come out of the side and shoot smoke rings across the audience.
I think that's what the young people like.
It engages the young people, but it also gets them to understand the story that goes with it. And so it's not that the technology is a substitute for the story or overpowers the story.
But it kind of puts some power behind the story.
It underscores the things we want people to remember.
And then as they come out of the theater, they walk through the log cabin. They see where this man started his literally humble life.
Correct.
In Kentucky. And they can kind of feel for themselves what life must have been like living there. And then they start to walk through his life. And I think as they make the journey through this museum, they are walking through it. Let's you and I talk through a few of these things.
Sure.
But I want to take it beyond the cabin, log cabin, beyond Lincoln the lawyer, Lincoln the state legislator, Lincoln the failed presidential candidate. Let's get closer to that Civil War chapter. Because right outside these doors, for those who want to look, is a train station that is rather significant and historic. And it was from that spot where Abraham Lincoln left this town the last time he would ever see it alive and went out to Washington to be president. He couldn't have picked a more challenging moment in America's history to become the new president as he headed out.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about that journey.
Well, even before Lincoln left Springfield, he had received literally dozens of death threats and had been sent poisoned food. He knew when he left Springfield there were people out there that wanted to see him dead. 7 southern states had already left the Union simply because of his election. Nothing that he said, nothing that he did could have been the cause of their leaving. It was the fear of what the Republican Party stood for in the future. When Lincoln got to Harrisburg in Pennsylvania, news was received that there would be an attempt at his life in Baltimore as he changed trains. When he was raising the flag in front of Independence Hall in Philadelphia, he must have had that on his mind because he said, sooner than surrender these principles, meaning all men are created equal in the Declaration, I would rather be assassinated on the spot. He finally conceded to wiser counsel not to follow the schedule, but to take an earlier train into Washington. So he arrived without any fanfare, without any notice. He was carrying a cape and had a soft hat. And newspaper critics made that to be Lincoln in a Scotch kilt with a Scotch cap. And that's in our Whispering Gallery. It shows all of these really devastating cartoons. Lincoln was then branded to be a coward. He snuck into Washington. And so I think throughout his presidency, Lincoln was so struck by that. He didn't want people to think of him being a coward. And so he often just refused any kind of security detail, which may in fact have been his undoing.
I try to imagine, and I can't, what it must have been like for this man to come to Washington at the beginning of this war that claimed so many American lives, a war which was so bloody, with so much suffering, where he as president was ordering more and more men into battle and watching as they were being killed in numbers unparalleled, certainly in our history, maybe in going back into history with very few parallels, and the emotional toll it must have taken on him. We have one exhibit here that talks about the actual loss of life in the Civil War, that is one that just, once you see it, you'll never forget it. Tell us about that exhibit.
One of the things that we're trying to get across, and that's very difficult, both for historians and the general public, what did all these battles mean? So we created a map that showed the changing lines of battle, where 1 second equals 1 week of fighting, to give people this sense of what these battles meant in terms of the fortunes of war for both the Union and the Confederacy. But we also do what we call during the process the odometer of death, but it's the casualty counter. Casualty is not necessarily a death, but anything that takes someone off the field of battle. So a wound, prisoner of war, missing in action, these are all casualties. What it shows during the winter months, when there's very little action on the battlefield, that is going like crazy. Disease would sweep through the camps of both sides during the winter months as they made camp for the winter, because their water supply would get contaminated. More soldiers died from disease than bullets or bayonets. The actual number that died, roughly 620 to 680,000. But the total casualty figure comes to about 1.4 million. It was horrendous. America has never witnessed that kind of carnage. Antietam still is the bloodiest single day of battle, 25,000 died. And you really have to take the deaths of all previous wars, beginning with the American Revolution up to Vietnam, to equal the number dead in the Civil War.
There's another exhibit here that people talk about. I talk about a lot of them. That one that calculates the death. But the other one is a very graphic display of slavery. It is something that once you've seen it, you'll never forget it. That shows what would you describe it? I think it's best since you're the one who's helping us to understand this.
Well, in 1828, Lincoln took a flatboat of goods. He was living in Indiana at the time, down to New Orleans, where they were sold. And it was his first encounter with the city of New Orleans, which of course had roots in a French culture initially, but it was also a center for the selling of slaves. And so Lincoln would have witnessed his first slave auction there. We wanted to show that most people think that the brutality of slavery are the chains and the physical beatings of slaves. But the real brutality is the separation of families.
Tearing these families apart.
Husbands and wives and children are all going different directions. And that's what we portray. We want people to understand that Lincoln understood the European criticism. They say, you say that you believe that all men are created equal, and yet you have slaves. How does that comport, selling human beings with claiming that all men are equal? And many in the North understood that, but they also understood that the Constitution was a compromise document to create a country. the founding generation hoped that the document would evolve and change to allow for greater freedom. But unfortunately, it required the Civil War and the loss of all of that life.
So let me ask you, the one thing that seems to have really been a turning point in his thinking, his life, was the memory of that experience, all the debate about slavery leading up to his race for the Senate, then his race for the presidency, coming into the presidency with the Civil War, and then that historic day when he signs this Emancipation Proclamation. Why is this such a seminal event in our nation's history and Lincoln's life?
I think being a lawyer, Lincoln understood that slaves were considered property. In order to get them from property to personhood, that would require a constitutional amendment. But he also understood that using the definition of slaves as property, as commander-in-chief, he could issue this Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves, taking them as kind of contrabands of war, so to speak, but that it only had force as long as the war was going on. But it was very important to make that symbolic gesture, because what it did is it told the South, we will no longer allow you to keep your slaves. We are offering them freedom. And blacks in the North, who really felt that they had no reason to fight this war for the white man's union, all of a sudden realized, well, this army is now an army of liberation. And we can wear the Union uniform and fight and free other blacks in bondage.
This was it seems to me to be a big psychological turning point in the war. I think one of the most amazing moments in American history was written up in a book called April 1865 by Jay Winnick. Winnick published his book at a time when the biography of John Adams was coming out, so it was eclipsing his good effort on April 1865. But he talks about that amazing second inaugural address of Lincoln's, which I thought captured so much of this man at this moment in history as they were nearing the end of the war, and he spoke to the American people. Tell me what you remember from that.
Well, it is, you have to keep in mind, Lincoln was the first president since Andrew Jackson to have been reelected to a second term. So he had this string of one-term presidents, and everyone assumed Lincoln was going to be another one. It wasn't until Sherman's victory at Atlanta gave the North enough confidence the war was nearing an end. Everyone assumed Lincoln would get up and talk about the end of the war and how well the troops had fought. Kind of a boost, a morale boost for a war-weary North. Instead, Lincoln gives this very deep meditation explaining why the war lasted so long and why so much blood had to be shed. And rather than putting the onus of the war on the South and slavery, he did say that this war was about slavery. And that both the North, by allowing it and actually profiting from it, and the South, by maintaining it, as well as profiting from it, were equally culpable. That this was a national sin, and that it could only be expiated by blood. And that, God had nothing to do with the outcome, since both sides read the same Bible, prayed to the same God. But what Lincoln did see coming out of the war was, again, a sense of reconciliation.
With malice toward none.
Correct, yeah.
An amazing statement after all of the lives that had been lost.
Yeah. And without claiming that any side was superior over the other. That, this was a national tragedy. Both sides needed to learn from it to heal and move forward.
Those moments in world history are so few but so profound. I think of Nelson Mandela and his reaction after all of the time he spent in prison to invite his jailer to his inaugural ceremony when he's sworn in as president. And I think that that really harkens back to the spirit that Lincoln was trying to capture in 1864 with that 1865 with that second inaugural address. Now, for those who take the tour of the theater from start to finish before they get back out to the great gift shop here, there's one terrific stop here with Ghosts of the Library, which I recall it's at the Ask Mr. Lincoln Theater here, which I recall being one of the most interesting things I had ever seen. Tell us about that, which I know a lot of people remember as they leave the museum. They think they've seen it all. Then the closing film and presentation that are presented to them. Tell us about that.
There are only 2 other theaters like this in the entire world that use this patented technology. And essentially it uses holovision, or kind of holograms, that tell the story of why we collect all this stuff. We wanted to connect the library collections to what's here in the museum. Every story we tell here is based upon research that we did with the original materials in the library. And so when someone goes to the library to do research, they in essence conjure up these ghosts, the stories within the documents, within the artifacts. And so we kind of visually show that in the story of the Holovision Theater, the Ghosts of the Library, that all of these things have stories to tell.
But you do it in such a way. You know, we've teased people a little bit in the show about this Ghosts of the Library. Maybe the best thing to do is to give them a couple minutes and they'll get an idea of what's in store for them if they come down here to Springfield to visit the museum and see this movie.
Terrific.
Sometimes, if you listen deeply, the history comes to life. One of our jobs is to collect rare manuscripts. Ever wonder what a Civil War battle was really like? Here's a journal of a young soldier who was there. I heard the screaming and bursting of shells, canister, and shrapnel. The death screams of wounded animals. The groans of their human companions, wounded and dying. A perfect hell on earth. By studying these memories, we create our own experience of those times, as if we had been there with them long ago. Sometimes, in our imaginations, these people seem so real. We finally resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth
of the freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
The power of those words almost makes you feel like he's right here with us. This might surprise you, but this collection is still growing. We get new items all the time.
It gets people to come to the library, and that's a great thing.
And the gift shop here.
You know, one of the things that we wanted to do is when people came to the museum that they left changed. And one of the things that we have noticed, the best-selling item in our gift shop are the books.
That's great.
Which means that people are interested enough in what they see here that they buy a book to want to continue the study of Lincoln when they get home.
Well, as state historian, you've got to be pretty happy with that.
I think everyone in this state has reason to be proud.
That's great.
Of this museum, but of Mr. Lincoln.
Tom Schwartz, thanks for the tour and
Thank
the
you.
information about this great Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us today with my Capitol Report, A Different View. But if you want to learn some more about President Lincoln and about this place, go to presidentlincoln.org. That's presidentlincoln.org. It's a great source of information, but the best thing you can do is come to Springfield. And if you come here and visit the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Museum and Library, believe me, you'll feel like most visitors. You can't wait to come back and tell your friends about it. Our next episode is going to take us back to Washington, D.C. We're going to consider what happened that fateful night when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated and the manhunt that followed as they went after John Wilkes Booth and the co-conspirators. It's an amazing American story.